The club has connections with the Museum of History and Industry. 3 names come to mind. An early patron saint, Bob already alluded to him, Horace McCurdy. Jim's, plural, our members, dad and grandfather. Prior executive director, our member Jim Warren, and the current executive director, member Leonard Garfield. Mohi started at the turn of the century. It's located in the Montlake neighborhood by 520, but it's preparing to move soon to the former Naval Reserve Armory that's at South Lake Union. Mohi has millions of documents and artifacts relating to our local history. One important historical event was the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition. To showcase that history and legacy and peek at the 2009 centennial celebration, we have Mohi Executive Director Leonard Garfield. Think of questions if we have time. Now, please join me in welcoming him. Leonard.
Well, thank you, President John, and thank all of you. Next year is a big year for all of us in this room. It's a great big year for Rotary 4. We know that, and it sounds like it's a big year for the Rotary down Tacoma as well. It's a huge year for the whole community, and I want to take a few moments today to give you a little prelude of what you're going to be hearing a lot about over the next 24 months. You know, we often these days think of Seattle as a place with internationalism in its DNA, and we are always looking toward the future. Our horizon is way beyond our own borders. And some of us, though, may think of that international character that we share as something fairly recent in our history. But I think that's probably not the case. In fact, if you were to go back to our history, you'd probably have to go back to those first pioneers in the 1850s who were trading with Australia and South America and Asia even before they were trading with their folks in the eastern United States. Or to those business people in the late 19th century who recognized that Japan was one business day closer to Seattle and got on with that. Or to the folks who took a Canadian event, essentially the last great gold rush of the 19th century, and turned it into a Seattle brand. That internationalism has been around for an awfully long time. But if we were to pick one year in particular where that spirit really came to pass, I think it would be the year 1909. That spring of 1909, Seattle grabbed a hold of the global spotlight as never before with an absolutely astonishing and in many ways an improbable civic celebration called the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition, or the AYP for short. As we approach the centennial of that remarkable event, I want to take a few moments to reintroduce you to what was really Seattle's first World's Fair, an international gathering conceived by civic leaders to mark the good fortune and the vast wealth that was accumulated during the gold rush at the turn of the last century. And I hope to show that that exposition that grew from their plans was more than just an act of boosterism. It was an event that profoundly recast our own sense of who we were and what we were going to become. The fair's inspiration dates to 12 years before, to the summer of 1897, when this very ship, the SS Portland, steamed into Elliott Bay loaded famously with its so-called ton of gold. It was actually more than that. Suddenly the gold rush was on and Seattle was ready for it. For the next 10 years, the city fortune soared as Seattle positioned itself as the gateway to northern riches, the outfitter of fortune seekers, the city where the newly rich could set up shop and make their home. And after nearly a decade of stunning growth, city leaders decided that a commemoration was called for. And not just any old party, but a world's exposition very much along the lines of the grand fairs of Chicago in 1893 or St. Louis in 1904. But unlike those earlier fairs, which took as their inspiration historical events, they really looked backward. Columbus's voyage in the case of Chicago, and the Louisiana Purchase in the case of St. Louis. Seattle planners decided to celebrate our unique geopolitical location, our future at the apex of a growing global economy focused not on the eastern United States or even Europe, as much as on resource-rich Canada and Alaska, the booming markets, technologies, and peoples of the Pacific Rim, and the trade and the cultural ties that bound this brand new world together, the Alaska Yukon Pacific. The name really wasn't very sonorous, but it said it all. And the symbol of the fair that was selected painted the picture. Classical in their garb, perhaps, but future-oriented in their prospect, these three graces, if you look carefully, are armed with railroads heading west from the American hinterland to meet steamships from Asian ports. And they're joining forces in the great Northwest that we live in, envisioned in this illustration as a golden place of rich natural and technological resources, a world where the sun is rising and Seattle is in its glow. That was the vision, and these are some of the supremely pragmatic Seattle business and political leaders who came together to transform that vision into reality. Hard-driving businessmen like James Kleiss, civic leaders like Josiah Collins, bankers like J.S. Chilberg, newspaper men like Alden Blethyn, and folks like the tireless UW professor and promoter Edmund Meany, who saw the fair as an impetus to a great university. These are the men who raised the flag on the vision and then raised the money through government grants, through popular subscription, and through less popular but highly effective corporate arm twisting. Some things haven't changed, apparently. Their initial plan was to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the arrival of gold back in 1897. Unfortunately, Jamestown, Virginia, chose that day to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the settlement of the first English colony in America. So Seattle, way in the distance, decided to bide its time and claimed instead 1909, but they promptly got to work. And what an amazing piece of work it was. For those of you who have not seen illustrations of the fair, this will be a revelation in some ways, as it was to me when decades ago I first became aware of it. From the beginning, the goals of the AYP were multiple. Promote Seattle's role in international trade, showcase the new commerce and technology that we were pioneering, and very importantly, and I'm glad Bob is here, we talked about this earlier, leave as a legacy a university campus where the fair spirit of globalism and innovation would actually live on to serve generations of students. It was both visionary and supremely practical. The organizers invited countries and companies from around the world to participate. They retained leading architects to create a fantastical urban vision, and they hired the renowned Olmsted brothers, who only a few years before had chartered our city park system, to shape a campus at this very new UW site north of the city, where some 260 acres of mostly old-growth timber provided a spectacular canvas and stunning views towards Mount Rainier. On June 1st, 1907, interestingly, as the Jamestown celebration got underway, the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition broke ground at what's now the University of Washington. This is a shot from that opening day. 15,000 Seattleites attended that day. This is in a city with maybe 150,000 people. And apparently the excitement was almost too much to handle. Inexplicably, one of the fellows in that crowd shot rushed the stage and stole the golden pick. Someone else swiped the gilded shovel. And in the commotion, the crowd surged toward the grandstand that you see there. They tore the bunting and ribbon. One woman scrambled up and ripped off all the flags. The stage, apparently, according to the Seattle Times, was picked clean, except for a few flags that would fly later on in the exposition 2 years later. Apparently, this was not going to be like Jamestown celebration. But the rest of the work was considerably more serious and a lot more orderly, and for the next 2 years, builders and designers and carpenters and architects and artists and landscapers, businessmen and diplomats, writers and craftspeople, every skill in the community came together to work feverishly to meet this 2-year goal to open up on June 1st of 1909. So this is 1907, and 1909 was the opening date. And with amazing speed, if you can imagine that just in 2 years that raw land took this shape on the area that we now know as UW. Now simultaneously, the larger region was transforming. Streetcar lines were laid out from downtown Seattle to the future fair site. A new pergola was designed for Pioneer Square. The pergola we all loved, it was to shelter visitors to the fair while they were waiting for the streetcars. Uptown, the Moore Theater opened a little bit early in anticipation of the crowds that would come, and hotels across the region opened up. And suddenly, the university's remote location became an amazing world, very much alive. The most stunning feature of the fair was the Arctic Circle. We now know this as the Rainier Vista, of course, but this was really what they called the White City that was at the heart of the exposition. It had the grand dome of the government building at its apex, and along the sides it had 6 classical temples. The 6 were named for Asia, Alaska, Hawaii, Europe, agriculture, the one you see in front of you, and manufacturing. And elsewhere on the grounds, there were a number of other buildings as well. The Alaska building featured, of course, gold, not a big surprise. Over $1 million worth of it was stored in the building in dust and bricks and nuggets. It was quite a event, and they promoted almost the security as much as they did the actual features. And inside, rather, I should say that some of the buildings that had fairly prosaic purposes, this is the timber building, a little bit low for those of you in the back. This is a wonderful building that featured a colonnade of timbers masquerading as columns here that were 5 stories tall. It was a wooden marvel. There might be some people in our club perhaps who still remember this. It actually stood on the campus until the 1930s when the resident termites apparently completed their destruction of it, and it went down. But one of the amazing features also, which no longer stands, running through the spine of that Arctic Circle, was a waterfall which cascaded down from the government building. Here you see it being built, and here it's leading down in cascading steps from the government building all the way toward the reflecting pond, which we now know as Drumheller Fountain, which then was known as the Geyser Basin. Inside these amazing buildings, there were exhibits. Some of them were quite prosaic. Some of them were quite fantastical. They were replicas of working coal mines and factories. They included technological innovations like pediatric incubators with live infants included in each of these incubators. This was new technology, and everybody was recruited to help show how it was going to work. Set amidst fountains and formal gardens, the fair was an incredible vision, and that's what it was. It was a vision by day or by night. Now, if the axis of the fair was devoted to the arts and the sciences, to the higher purposes, there was an immensely popular sideshow. It was called the Pay Streak, sort of in keeping with the Gold Rush theme, and it provided a more exotic touch. It also helped pay the bills. But internationalism reigned here as well. You'll see some references to different cultures here. The cosmopolitan attractions ranged from the Eskimos from Siberia to native peoples, the Igorotes of the Philippines. And a serious note needs to be injected here because this kind of anthropological use of human beings as sort of specimens is both a sign of a real interest in internationalism, but also a sign and a lack of knowledge and the kind of humanity that one would expect today in any kind of cultural presentation. But those were the kinds of attractions that were there. You could also learn more about history. This was devoted to the Battle of the Monitor and Merrimack, or you could watch just regular folks today fight it out. This was the boxing hall. When everything was finished and when the plaster had dried, the show did open on time. Here we see Edmund Meany kind of exhorting the opening day crowd, but it actually opened at 12 noon in the other Washington, in the White House, where President Taft pressed a telegraph key made from a nugget of gold from the Klondike. That sent a signal to New York, which sent a signal by telegraph to Seattle. That set off whistles and bells and factory alarms, and Seattle was completely filled with noise, and the fair had opened. James J. Hill, the greatest railroad baron of all time, came to Seattle to do the opening honors. I think he felt this was sort of a pet city of his. And when he pulled the cord, the largest American flag that was ever made unfurled. We've talked about maybe finding out where that large American flag went to, because that'd be a wonderful thing to see again. The show was on, and on that very first day, here's the opening day crowd, 79,000 people came through the turnstiles on that first day. The fair ran for 138 days. The summer and the early fall, it went to October 16th, were filled with special events. There was Japan Day, and there was World's Children Day. Here's a car filled with kids from all over the world who came to this very far place on the globe to celebrate in this way. And then I saw this in my research. Can you see that from a distance? It looks like these guys were wearing kilts. I looked it up. It was Ralph Monroe Day, apparently. And one of the great events of the fair was that a Ford automobile arrived at the fairgrounds from New York City. It completed the first ever transcontinental automobile race across North America. There's a great story behind that. The thin gentleman in the top coat to the right, to the left of the driver, that's Henry Ford, came out to the fair. He called that car the Model T. It was probably, and I've done some research on this, it was probably considered, Henry Ford, who was a brilliant merchandiser, it was considered his greatest masterstroke of publicity that the first transcontinental race he managed to have this car win. As it turns out, he cheated a little bit. At Snoqualmie Pass, he replaced the engine. The award was taken away from Ford 6 months later and given to the real winner, an Italian firm called the Schaumet Car Company. Unfortunately, they had gone out of business, and Ford was on his way. But that happened at the fair. And if you weren't satisfied with driving around, you could get up above it all in this wonderful airship that periodically took passengers above and gave them a little sense of the aviation history that was yet to come. One of my favorite illustrations is Timber Day. There are 55 school kids there sitting on a single piece of milled lumber, the largest one in the world. I forget how many feet it was. And women gathered at the fair. It was very important. The National Association of Women's Suffrage Movement had their national convention at the fair, and that led to the early adoption of women's suffrage here in Washington State. So there's some very progressive political things happening as well. I like this particular allegorical image that was unveiled at the fair. It's a sort of a new image for Seattle. We've got beflowered maidens that are riding clamshells, if you can see that, pulled by spawning salmon down a canal that's lined with totem poles. Now that's rebranding. Many dignitaries, of course, came, and that was a big deal because it took a long time to get here. President Taft himself came. He was a little bit begrudging it, but he came, he did his thing, he went to the exhibits, he gave speeches, he went to a livestock parade. When it was all done, he actually did what he really wanted to do, which is he headed north to the Highlands, and he went to the Seattle Golf and Country Club, which had moved from Laurelhurst to tie in with what we were talking about, and he played a round of golf with Josiah Collins, and that seemed to appeal to him a great deal. But the fair was amazing. During its summer-long run, the turnstiles turned so often that the fair's promoters could truthfully fulfill their promise to break even. That's not a small feat. More than 3.7 million people from around the world had attended when it had closed in mid-October, and organizers actually realized a profit of about $63,000, which they donated to the Anti-Tuberculosis League, which is an issue I know that's close to Rotary, and to the Siemens Institute. What happened to all those structures? Most of them, as you know, have long since were torn down. They were actually impractical for extended use, so they were intended to be torn down. Most of them were right after the fair. But some were built of brick or heavier materials, and they survived. Meany Hall, many of you know, stood until about 1964 when it was weakened by the earthquake. The current architecture building, or the building that's called the architecture building at UW, is one of the original fair buildings. It was the Fine Art Building. There's another smaller building made out of wood that is known as the Imogene Cunningham Building. It was the old women's building at the fair. But even though very few of these structures actually remain, the most important legacy clearly is the design of the campus itself and the impetus that it did in fact provide to UW's growth. Before the Exposition, UW had 6 buildings on that distant location. They gained an additional 20 more or less permanent buildings from the Exhibition, and of course one of the most remarkable and beautiful campus plans in the nation. And the city too gained a tremendous boost and a notable spike in development and construction. It was a period of great growth and energy spiked by this fair. This club's founding in the summer of 1909 is one example of that energy that was racing through Seattle at that time, and there are many other examples. A few years ago, I worked with some students to compile an inventory of structures built during the fair period, and it's a long and very impressive list. And just as importantly, the fair reinforced the notion that Alaska and the Far East were clearly within our sphere of influence, that we were not just a portal to these regions as had been popularly assumed, but we were a central part of that network. And of the 3 million plus visitors who came, countless actually came back to live. And some were so entranced and enthralled by the fair that they actually never left at all. And there are many stories of that. The memory of the fair was sufficiently vivid that even in the post-World War II boom, when we had a whole new reason to celebrate, city fathers felt the tug of the AYP enough that they wanted to have a Second World's Fair mainly to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the AYP. I think you all know that. And while that fair was a little bit late starting, not 59 but 62 of course, Century 21 did share with the AYP that sense of looking towards the future and celebrating that rather than dwelling on the past. Now, with 100 years on our doorstep, how do we once again remember 1909? Today, in a sense, I'm sharing with you for the first time publicly that Mayor Nichols has convened both an AYP task force and an AYP Blue Ribbon Commission. Its members include several members of our club, as well as many others, who will suggest and coordinate a series of activities intended to raise public awareness about the lasting legacy of the fair, including the publication of several books, a unique website, displays at several museums and public venues, and some very special events, including a reenactment of the 1909 road race. Familiar Seattle events will take on a new cast. For example, Northwest Folklife will kick off the summer of '09 with a focus on the cultures of Alaska, Yukon, and the Pacific Rim. And the partners in this endeavor range from the UW to many civic and cultural organizations, including, of course, MOHI, from the Greater Seattle Chamber of Commerce to our counterparts and colleagues even in Alaska and Canada, and, of course, our public partners at the city, county, and state. In remembering, there is less interest really in nostalgia as much as in examining the spirit of innovation and internationalism that shaped the fair, to look at the seeds it planted and the fruit it might yet bear. Because this was very special, and I just would like to close with a couple of very quick thoughts. Consider, if you will, that this was a fair that popularized the notion of the Pacific Rim almost a century before it became a dominant reality in our world. It was a fair that envisioned a free exchange in North America of both commerce and ideas, 80, 90 years before NAFTA. It was a fair that celebrated the natural environment and cultural exchange when both of those ideas were really far from most people's minds. And it envisioned Seattle at the very center of all of that. In a phrase, this was the fair that imagined the Seattle we would become. I hope you'll join us as we spend 2009 remembering the AYP, not just for the special time it was, but for the special spirit evoked, a spirit that still enriches the city today. And if you'd like to learn more, feel free to send me an email. There's an automatic email update that will keep you posted. You can send it to my address, no message necessary. I'll just forward it to the address person. Or you can go on historylink.org, the wonderful encyclopedia of, online encyclopedia of Seattle history. Or soon, there'll be a special website that keeps you up to date on all the things related to AYP and the celebration to come. So thank you very much.
We got a couple of minutes, so if you have any questions, we might be able to take two. Here's one right here.
I thought that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. My question is, can you compare what it took politically to have something like that then versus what it would take today?
Let me tell you what this is a little bit like what President John's going to do to us. Let me tell you example of one way they raised money. A certain newspaper publisher, whose name won't be mentioned, but is a wonderful publisher and a wonderful newspaper, would print on the front page of the newspaper all those businesses and business leaders who had failed to kick in their little bit of the ante. So I don't know if we want to recommend that, but it's a style. I'll give that to John to think about. It took a lot of political arm twisting, but remember this. Seattle was a smaller community, and the room in which decision makers met was much smaller and much less open than it is today. So, you know, the good news and the bad news that I think we have to weigh out.
Hold on just a second so we can get a mic over there, because it's being videoed, and Leonard needs to hear it.
Any thoughts been given to a legacy from this, like Mohai's new museum or something that will be not just a celebration, but will actually be using this to get a permanent something for the region or the city?
Well, I think that's a great idea. And the mayor's task force, and again, you see ways on the screen, or you saw them briefly, on how to communicate, will be collecting ideas like that. And the final sort of menu, if you will, of activities and so forth will come out later this year. So I'll pass that recommendation on.
Contrary to the speech, I did not go to the fair. But my father did. And we still have the tickets. We have the little doll. We have the box of whatever it was, the souvenirs and all that stuff at home. They went in from the west side of Bainbridge Island, took the steamboat in, and they went with the neighbors. We were Scottish. We were very generous people. The neighbors were Swedes, and they were pretty cheap. And so my grandfather paid the nickel to ride the streetcar out to the fair, but the neighbor wanted to save the money, so he wouldn't pay the nickel, so those kids had to walk. And the only comment was that my dad always said we walked a lot of the ways, we walked through the woods to get out to the university at that time. So what a change.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Leonard. Appreciate that. You've showcased Seattle's Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition. Steve, thank you for coming. Little did you know that today was going to be UW Day, but it's okay because that's his employer. That's who he works for. It represents him down there in the south part of the Sound. Next week's special, The Business Mentors Program featuring Phil Condit, former Boeing CEO and chairman, with a talk entitled Leadership in a Turbulent World. It's been great being with you today. We're adjourned.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.